In the long tradition, that's what you're in the long tradition of protest against structural injustice, you're in the long tradition that started many years ago in our country. First in giving King George III his exit papers, then the abolition of slavery movement, then the women's right to vote movement, then the farmer, populist, progressive movement against the big banks and railroad companies over 100 years ago. And then the industrial and mining workers movement for trade unions decades ago that built the middle class in this country and told the giant corporations of those days, this far and no farther in your oppression and greed. You are in the long tradition of the civil rights movements and the environmental movements and the worker health and safety movements. And you know what about all those movements? While it took some time, and while the dominant business community opposed every major social justice movement in this country, including Social Security, even though they opposed and delayed, all these popular movements prevailed, and so will you. Now, the focus this weekend is on the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, but obviously they're part and parcel of the autocratic systems of governance imposed increasingly now by the World Trade Organization, which subordinates our democratic processes here and around the world to the imperatives of commercial trade, subordinating health and safety and environment to the imperatives of international oligarchs. It's all part of the same drive for these corporations. When they can't get fully their way at the local, state, and national level, they move to establish transnational institutions. And now the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank are under increasing criticism from conservatives in Congress. They've been severely criticized by economists like Joe Stiglitz, the former chief economist for the World Bank, like Jeffrey Sachs at Harvard University, from George Soros himself, a very severe and basic critic of the global financial system that is now operating to increase instability. It's not like it's just progressive forces. The IMF and the World Bank have stumbled so often, have gotten into the wrong company so often, have used their money pumps to fund the wrong projects so often, which have had such devastating effects on the poor and the environment, that they are now uniting both progressive and conservative forces. That alone is probably their greatest singular achievement of recent times. Now, if you ask yourself exactly what is the environment for the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, what do they have to deal with? Who do they have to cave to day after day? First, it's the big corporations. The big corporations like the construction companies, like Bechtel, like the oil companies, like Exxon, like the chemical companies, like the timber companies. What are they looking for from the IMF and World Bank? What are the banks in New York and Chicago and Los Angeles? What are they looking for from the IMF and the World Bank? Here's what they're looking for in a nutshell. They're looking for taxpayer-subsidized business deals and taxpayer-subsidized bailouts when their greed get them in trouble, as it did with the banks in East Asia. Now, you talk to people in the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, they don't all have horns. There's some good people there. The World Bank has had some minor success in their health and education projects, but by and large, the governors of the World Bank and the IMF, the upper staff, these people, while they declare their good intentions, as James Wolfenson has in recent speeches, they haven't taken into account the terrible consequences of these so-called good intentions. Why, for example, after their declared intention at the World Bank that they want to fight poverty, or at the IMF that they want to stabilize communities or in countries, why is it that they're basically entrenching conditions that breed horrible poverty and injustice and cruelty and mortality and morbidity rates and the desecration of basic life-sustaining environments? Why is it that the IMF manages to stable the giant financiers astride the globe, but they don't seem to stable the terrible conditions that are experiencing their wreckage on billions of people all over the globe? And the answer is that these institutions are paying homage to the big corporations in the West that want business deals, business bailouts, and they're also have to kneel down before the authoritarian governments abroad, their corruption, as well as the billionaire oligarchs that are in unity with the crooked politicians. So how can the IMF and World Bank, even given their intentions, ever get down to the people? How can they ever side with the peasants? How can they ever side with the workers in South America, Asia, and Africa? Just in the last 3 years, here's what the International Monetary Fund has done. Are there any standards of failure for the International Monetary Fund that would argue for its abandonment and replacement with a people-oriented institution? Here, quickly, are there failures. The International Monetary Fund has contributed to and worsened financial crisis in Asia and elsewhere. It has watched as billions of your taxpayer dollars were stolen in Russia by the corruption that is so entrenched that it can be said that the tormented Russian people, once having suffered under criminal communism, are now suffering under criminal capitalism. And our taxpayers are funding these crooks. The IMF has failed to respond in decisive ways to the growing global demand for debt cancellation for poor countries under the yoke of debt where they have to pay Western financial institutions and governments what they should be investing in health and safety and education and schools and in food and other productive operations. The IMF has also continued to push its environmentally destructive export-led development mode. The impact of the IMF and the World Bank is to impose debt, deprivation, and disaster on third world people. Debt, deprivation, and disaster. They are trying to impose a wholly inappropriate set of Western technologies and gigantic projects. They're trying to impose Western multinational corporate imprints on local economies with different cultures, different traditions, and certainly different needs. For example, what is the alternative model that will produce economic justice for these peoples in the world? A lot of them were established in our country. These people need land reform so they can produce food for their families. That comes up against the local oligarchs and the dictatorships. And that is what, of course, turns the IMF and the World Bank in other directions. These people need trade union rights and need rights to form independent trade unions. And if anything, indirectly, the IMF has discouraged the formation of trade unions and encouraged the suppression of workers' efforts in this regard. Third world peoples need all-out assaults on global infectious diseases, malaria, tuberculosis, dysentery, meningitis, AIDS, and pneumonia. It's hard to work every day, isn't it, when you've got these kinds of diseases? They need microcredit, not giant loans to crooked governments, which are cycled back to greedy multinational corporations. If there's anything the people of this country must first realize, it is their tax dollars that are being misused in the billions and billions and billions of dollars. through these institutions, misused to strengthen the power of Western corporations in cahoots with authoritarian and suppressive systems in these third world countries. Let me suggest in concluding that it is our duty, because we are able to make a greater difference because of the country we live in, the traditions we wish to expand on in our progressive history of surmounting injustice. It is our duty to spread the word, to spread the organizing, to spread the information that will inform people all over the country when you go back home, into church basements, union local halls, university auditoriums, town squares, all public space, and go into those malls too. And remember the public space called the public airwaves, which we own and the radio and TV stations control and pay us no rent and keep the owners off our own property. And one last word to the press, the TV, radio, and the press. Not that this will ever affect the ignorant Tom Friedman of the New York Times, but we at least hope that the reporters will start reading, will start thinking, will start talking about the viewpoints expressed here and around the world, instead of engaging in their knee-jerk reactions, as if this is just a struggle between protectionists in the old way and free traders. This is a struggle against corporate managed trade that suppresses democratic processes, that suppresses local self-reliance in these continents, that suppresses the indigenous knowledge of these continents, that suppresses the determination to lift their standards of living and standards of justice for the billions of people on the earth who can hardly eat, hardly breathe, hardly get through a day without the enormous pain of this structural injustice that stems from the concentration of power and wealth in too few hands. The top 300 richest people in the world have wealth equal to the bottom 3 billion people in the world. These disparities must stop, and I urge you to go beyond this protest and beyond the use of your constitutional rights and build epicenters throughout the country and link these epicenters with similar ones throughout the world, directly through the internet and through whatever media and trips you can develop. One last point, and that is this. One last point. The only place where justice comes before work is in the dictionary. Make sure work comes before justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Ralph, for so eloquently stating the kind of vision and the kind of world that we want to build.